In the previous video, we looked at how we're using the multiplier to help us to understand the total change in the spending if we have initial change in the aggregate spending. And in this video, we will keep further to discussing our macro equilibrium we already learned in chapter 9. So in this case, we're looking for if we had the aggregate demand increase or decrease, how actually will have impact on the US economy. So the multiplier method actually will help us to understand the Keynes adjustment process as well. So Keynes said if the producer cut out bad unemployment when output exceed aggregate demand at the current price level, so we will find that the leakages will exceed the injection, so which means we have a lot of surplus on our society. So this will result loss of income will cause the consumer spend decline. So as we know, if decrease the employment and decrease wages, the consumer will have less disposable income, and then that will cause less spending. And then this is going to lead to further production cutback and more job loss and more lost income and still less consumption. So that is what happened in 1929 to 1933. So this is not can be not explained by the classical economists because they were thinking if the aggregate demand curve shift to the right, it will naturally shift back to the left. So it never ever happened during that period. So the Keynes said if we want the aggregate demand shift further, should shift further to the left as the multiplier process go into the effect. So the multiplier will make the situation worse. So now, so this is one thing we can talk about related macroeconomics. And another thing we want to introduce, we haven't learned, is about the recessionary GDP gap and how that gap created. So first, let's look at this diagram. So the initial aggregate demand curve is this downward line. So you can see under the initial aggregate demand curve, so the intersection between aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve, we got point F. So the point F, and it is actually corresponding to the QF, which is the full employment GDP. So that is the ideal case. So unfortunately, in 1929, or we talk about 2006, so the whole producer side had the trouble. So they decrease their production, decrease the investment, and which further decrease the consumer's disposable income, and the consumer disposable income decrease will cause consumer decrease their consumption. So what we see is actually our demand curve will shift to the new position, which is our AD curve. So the AD curve is on the left-hand side of AD0 curve. So at this point, the equilibrium point is landing at C. So the corresponding to C, we got the real output is QE. So the QE is smaller than QF. So this gap, we call it the recessionary gap, GDP gap. So the recessionary GDP gap is equal to the difference between equilibrium GDP and the full employment GDP. And in this case, the full employment GDP is larger than the equilibrium GDP. So we call it the recessionary GDP. And so in this case, if we have the recessionary GDP gap exist, and we will know that there is unused production capacity as the economy is under producing. So as we talk about in 1929, we have deficiency in consumption, and we're causing the producer doesn't want to produce, it doesn't want to hire people, and we have enough resources in this society, but the producer just doesn't want to produce. So that's why this gap actually indicate the economy is underproducing. The aggregate supply curve actually is a short run aggregate supply curve because it's not a vertical line. So what we're seeing here is when the aggregate demand curve shift back to the aggregate to the AD2 curve, and the GDP decrease, which means that unemployment rate will increase. But at the same time, the price level from P0 jumped to the PE. So it seems like there is a trade-off between the unemployment rate and the price level. So that's what we're going to discuss in the next slides. So the relationship, the trade-off between the unemployment and inflation. So let's imagine if the AS curve were a horizontal line. So let's see. if this is my AS curve, so if AS is a horizontal curve, so what happened if the aggregate demand curve from AD2 to shift to AD3? So what we're gonna see is actually our GDP increase from QE to QF. So from QE to QF. So which means our unemployment rate decrease because the GDP increase, we need to be able to hire more people to work and to increase the GDP. So QE to QF, we increase the decrease the unemployment rate, but at the same time the price keep on the PE. But is that true? No. So the fact is the aggregate supply curve has a slope upward. So it's slope upward. So when the AD2 shifts to AD3 to AD4, what we see is the equilibrium point change from C to G to H. So C to G to H. So as this equilibrium point keep changing, C to G to H, what we first seen is the QE also moved to QF. So the GDP is increased. So which means the unemployment is decreasing. So the unemployment decreasing. So that's good. That's what the government wants. And we want to fulfill this full employment GDP. We can achieve the full employment. But if you look at the price level, so the price level changed from PE increase to P3 to P4. So you can see actually the price level keep increasing. So our inflation is going up. So what happened here is an increase, the aggregate demand caused both output and price level to rise and employment to fall. So because what we're seeing is rising price, the economy must move to H, not the point F, and in order to close the recessionary GDP gap. So what this telling us is, yeah, we understand that if we want to boost the economy, if we are in a recession, and we do try to increase our GDP, but at the same time, you also need to realize purposely, we also increase the inflation. So there is a trade-off between the unemployment and inflation. So that's why in the previous chapter, we talk about what is full employment. So as we said, full employment should be the lowest rate of employment compatible with the price stability. So the price should be stable, and variously estimated at between 4 and 6% unemployment. So we cannot achieve zero unemployment because if that's the case, our inflation will be super high, and also our inflation rate will approximate 3%, about 3%. We didn't say zero inflation because if we don't have inflation, then our unemployment rate should be very high. So that's why. Let's further explain what we learned from chapter 8 and 8, 9, why we should have certain amount of inflation rate and why we should have a certain amount of unemployment rate. So after we talk about aggregate demand decrease and causing the recessionary GDP gap, they increase the inflation as well. So now how about another scenario? If the economy is overheated, so which means the aggregate demand shift to the right. So what can that happen? So that will cause the inflationary GDP gap. So let's look at, so the initial aggregate demand curve is located at 80. And by chance, so the investor, producer are so happy for the future economy, so they start to invest the money on the economy. So the initial increase gonna be causing a $100 billion increase in the GDP. As we know, the multiplier process. So increase $100 in the investment will causing the product total consumption will further increase by 300 billions. So that's why we see the two shift. So the 80 initially shift to the 85 because that caused by the change in the investment, and eventually it will shift to the 86 curve. Is because the multiplier process. So then the final landing is at the W point. So the initial equilibrium point is F. Corresponding to F, we got QF. So initial aggregate demand already landed at a very perfect location. That is full employment GDP. And after the investment boom in the economy and the final equilibrium, we end like a QE. So the QE is the equilibrium GDP after we shift in the demand curve. So then we found the QE is larger than QF. So this gap, we call it inflationary GDP gap. So inflation GDP gap equal to the difference between equilibrium GDP and the full employment GDP. So in this case, QE is larger than the QF. So in this case, we found the economy producing at the GDP level above the full employment GDP. So the economy subject to the inflationary pressure. So the economy is overheated. So if we have the inflation GDP gap, and what you're gonna see here is our price level is going really high. So the P0 is a ideal inflation rate, but because the overheated economy, so the price will be pulled up to P6. So what do we call this situation? So the price increase, yes, we increase the inflation. So we call it demand pulled inflation. So an excessive increase in the injection or decrease in the leakage can cause the economy to overheat. So which means if increase in the injection or decrease in the leakage will all causing the shortage on the market, then if we have shortage, the price will be pulled up. So that's caused the economy overheat. So which is the symptom will be the price level is too high. So the inflation rate is too high. So the aggregate demand pushed too far to the right, and it will generating an inflation, the rate GDP gap, and it will causing the demand pulled inflation, which is the price rise is due to the excessive aggregated demand. And in this case, we will find instability could cause an inflationary spiral.